Hi, folks. It's Andy. I encounter a lot of, and it's understandable, a lot of confusion around who we are, around how God made us, about our impulses and our desires. And most Christians are aware of verses in Genesis that talk about us being made in God's image, or the verses in Psalm that talk about us being formed in our mother's womb. But the questions I often get is, did God make me selfish? Did God make me greedy? And if I'm acting on an impulse of self-focus or greed that God gave me, created me with, implanted me with, if I'm acting on an impulse that comes natural, then why would God say that it's wrong? Why would God blame me for it? Did God make me that way? Did I mess up something that God made that gives me those desires and those impulses? And I encounter this confusion, I encounter these questions really in a couple different ways. There are a number of individuals who ask me the question. They're generally just confused, and it's pretty complicated. There's a few folks I've even dealt with who I would say were hurt. Why would God create me as a bad person? Why would God create me with these impulses, with these desires that he's immediately going to disapprove of? And I really think it hurts them as much as it confuses them. And then, of course, I've run into every week people who are really kind of using that's how God made me, I'm just doing what comes naturally thing. They're really using it as an excuse. So sure, I cheated on my spouse, but God just made me to love the ladies. That's just kind of how I'm wired. And if God didn't want me to cheat, then he shouldn't have made sex enjoyable. And sure, I'm acting on those impulses, but again, I'm just doing what comes natural. Talk to God. He's the one that wired me that way. So it runs the spectrum from, hey, can you help me understand this? It's kind of confusing, to, wow, this is really challenging me because it's hurting me in the sense I don't understand, to, hey, this looks like a good excuse to blame somebody else for what I'm doing that's hurting other people. And here's how I approach that issue. Here's how I begin to answer that question. It all starts with this. We can't look at things, even when we're talking about us and who created us and how we were created and what comes natural, we can't talk about things through a self-focused lens. So what we have to do is we have to look at things from a biblical lens. We have to look at things from a God-focused perspective. And even when I think about my life and my actions and my instincts, I've still got to think about what benefits, what glorifies, what makes sense from the Creator's standpoint, as opposed to what do I like, or what benefits me, or what makes sense if I look at the world through the Andy lens. And the prophet Isaiah tells us in the 43rd chapter of his long book in the Bible that the reason God made us was for his glory. Isaiah says, God has told me, call back my sons and daughters from afar, the people who I made for my glory, whom I formed and made, God says. So when we think about being formed and made by God, it was for God's glory. And once we shift that focus, now here's the challenge that I have. Every day I've ever woken up in my life, from time I was a child through becoming a minister at a church, every day that I woke up, it's always been, I want to focus on Andy. That's what's natural. I want to look after, number one. I naturally see the world through the lens of Andy. How does this impact me? And part of what being a Christian is to say, I've got to change that focus. I was actually created in God's image, but I was created to be dependent on God. I was created to actively worship God by intentionally choosing to put his will over my own. That's what I was created for. First and foremost, before we talk about anything Andy related or Andy focused, it's got to be, but I was made for God, by him, for his glory, in his image. And part of that is to be dependent on him, to worship him by choosing his view over my view, to basically give the moral authority to God, give the moral authority in my life over to God. And so in a sense, we live in a sin-cursed world, and we all have these self-focused, sinful desires, every one of us, and it may be different. Some may be more self-focused. Some may have more impulse or emotional control. Some may have greed. Some may have lust. Some may suffer with vanity or with pride. We all may have different issues that we struggle with. And yes, God made us, and yes, we are definitely made in God's image. But again, we are made to say, where my will goes against your will. I'm not necessarily looking to understand why would you make me that way or use it as an excuse to act out against God's moral authority. What I'm to say is where my will would counteract God's will, where my natural instincts would go against God's moral authority, I was actually made to say to God, I believe in you. I have faith in you. I'm dependent on you, and I will yield my life. I will surrender myself to your moral authority. And if we think about who we are, why we were formed and made in the image of God, and understand that the primary reason is so that we can glorify God by choosing to surrender to him, by choosing to have his will done first and foremost in our lives, it answers the question, who made us and why are we made this way? And then it also gives us that drive. It gives us that catalyst. It gives us that push, that desire to fully surrender and live our lives under God's moral leadership. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.